guys, yep, this is going to be a pretty long video on economics international trade actually. So yeah, you really should stop playing with your phone, iPad and whatnot. And especially the guy on the left side there, the second row, practically, you know that guy? Yeah. Okay, well, you see, I think Miss Uma is going to probably bombard us with a lot of questions. Us and you maybe. So you know what? Pay attention guys, and do enjoy.
Life has drawn you here. Feel the warmth pulling you near. Breathe it in and let it fill your heart. It's like love.
What have you done that I don't know about?
Cleanse your soul. Feel it in your veins. Breathe it in your lungs will stay. It's like love. For the first time, it'll all make sense, you know. Yeah, you know. You've seen it all before.
Back in the
till
early
you
days,
found something more.
they would always give him a piece of male turtle.
Breathe it in and let it fill your heart. It's like love, yeah. Cleanse your soul. Feel it in your veins. Breathe it in your lungs to stay. It's like love for the first time. It'll all make sense, you know. It's like love, cleanse your soul. Feel it in your veins. Breathe it in, your lungs will stay. It's like love for the first time. It'll all make sense. You know it.
Beautiful, isn't it? The video you just saw. Australia's culture stands out alone as a tourism attraction. From the lush greens and untouched wilderness to the marvelous buildings in main cities. People, the aborigines of the 21st century man. Australia's population of 22 million is a mix of cultures brought in from different countries itself. Now you see, even 24% of the population actually aren't even Australian. Now tourism in Australia is definitely a wondrous thing, but in the context of international trade, which is what we're focusing on, how does it affect Australia's tourism? In the sense of economy, Australia is the 13th largest economy in the world. In Asia, it's number 3, falling only behind China and Hong Kong. Well, the tertiary sector of Australia occupies the dominant position in the Australian economy. But the agricultural and mining sectors of Australia are the most important for its exports. Besides this, Australia is also a vast agricultural country that is the world's main export of wool, wheat and cotton, and also has 40% of the world's export in uranium. So, that I've listed all of these international trade exports, what role does international trade play when it comes to tourism in Australia? After slowing down due to global recession, in 2010, the Australian economy has been growing again, with an estimated growth rate of 3% of the GDP. This good economic performance owes to the government's fiscal policy of incentives, by the increase in household consumption, and especially by the continuous Chinese demand, which helps exports. the Australian government's priorities are to improve the country's competitiveness, namely with regards to the export competition of Asian countries and to deal with the challenges of its aging population and its environment, which is vulnerable to climatic problems. For example, droughts. Australia is a prosperous country and its per capita GDP is among the highest in the world. Despite the recent increase in unemployment rate due to global economic crisis, it remains consistently low, around 5%.
Hey guys, so in this session, me and my friend will talk about strength and weaknesses. So, in the strength and weaknesses of the tourism Australia, what are the strengths? So let's check it out.
Hi guys, today I'll be talking about Australia's strength in economy. One of the strengths in Australia's economy is that they have a stable environment. This is because the country's political environment is stable.
So people, what are the reasons that cause weaknesses to Australian tourism? That might be due to one reason, which is the measure of investment are lack of from the government.
Another one of Australia's points is that Australia has a practical access point for certain markets, like New Zealand and the Pacific Island. This makes Australia a choice for investment.
Well, what are the lack of investment? It might be due to two types, which is one, transport and telecommunication. It happens in public transport is because Australia has maintained one of the most extensive road network in the world. There is 40% of road network of 490,000 miles and 65% of total domestic freight tonnage is transported over the road system.
And the last one for today is that the community needs to know the broadly expected cost of the economy meeting targets. In the Australian economy, the one good thing about Australia is that they are built on the rich supply of natural resources.
Well, besides that, telecommunication sector is the star of Australian infrastructure. Why would I say that? It's because one of the half Australian population owns a cellular phone, which is the second world in preparedness for development in e-commerce. Move then, 50% of the Australian population is also connected to the internet.
Now, to list down each country by its contribution would take up too much time. Therefore, we summarize it up by region of two-way trade. What we mean by two-way trade is that it is inclusive of both imports and exports of goods and services. Well, to summarize up the regions, number 1 comes the APAC region, number 2 the OECD region, number 3 the Asian region, and number 4 the European Union. As you can see in the following graph, for the selected merchandise export in Australia during the year 2011, crude materials are 36.6%, which makes them the highest merchandise export. Minerals, fuels and lubricants are at 28.1%. They come next, as the mining industry in Australia is a dominant sector, as I mentioned earlier. Food and live animals are exported for 9.2% of total merchandise export. 26.1% are other miscellaneous exports. For merchandise imports in the year 2011, machinery and equipment are the main imports in Australia to the world. These equipments and machinery mainly have to do with manufacturing, transport and production equipment. Next, others imports such as tobacco and chemical etc. are at second level, which is to 3.7%. To summarize the main imports of Australia, they are machinery and transport equipment. And the main exports in Australia are mainly crude materials, as the mining sector in Australia is a very critical and dominant sector. Well, despite the impact of natural disasters and a decrease in tax receipts, Australia's budget position remains amongst the strongest in the developed world. The strong performance of the Australian economy is due to a number of factors, including number 1, Australia's strong economic institution, in particular a sound, stable financial and banking system. Did you know that no Australian bank collapsed or required a government bailout during the global financial crisis? 4 of the world's 9 most highly rated banking groups are Australian. Next, Australia's flexible and open trade and investment environment and well-targeted economic policies supporting business growth and innovation. Next, Australia's close trade and economic links with the emerging economies of Asia, which helped support growth and employment in 2010. While world trade values rose 18.8%, Australia's exports to China increased by 34% and Korea by 28%. The success of monetary and fiscal stimulus measures in supporting economic growth during the global financial crisis. The boom in the mining and resources sector is expected to see Australia's term of trade reach their highest sustained level in 140 years. The 2011 budget introduced measures that invest in the country's productive capability to maximize the benefits of the mining boom by targeted skills training and measures to boost participation. How does the international trade affect the tourism state of Australia? Well, as I mentioned earlier, tourism sectors in Australia only contribute an average of 5% to the Australian GDP. Therefore, in contrast, tourism does not really affect the trade status of Australia. But on our point of view, on the other hand, trade affects tourism in a myriad of ways. For example, the improvement and increase of activity in the exporting and import activities in Australia may contribute in improving the infrastructure of Australia, making Australia a more likeable place for tourists to visit, and also improving the overall experience of the tourists visiting Australia. The trade affects the tourism of Australia. Now, if you can see the graph for both export and import of 2011 to 2012, services at 16%, other goods including gold at 8%, primary products at 63%, ETM, which stands for Elaborately Transformed Manufacturers. It is a process beginning at raw material or intermediate product to become a final end product. Example, clothing, motor vehicles and machineries. STM, Simply Transformed Manufacturers, for example, paper, iron and plaster or Derrick. Both of these stand at 9% and 4% respectively. For imports, if you can see, ETM, Elaborately Transformed Manufacturers, are 50%, and STM stand at 5%, which is Simply Transformed Manufacturers. Services at 19%, primary products at 18%, and other goods at 8% for imports of Australia. Nearing the year end of 2011, the economy of Australia was actually doing very well. According to the information we gathered from the Australian satellite accounts online, Australia actually faced a trade surplus in the year 2011. Now, trade surplus occurs only when export amounts are higher than the amount of total import amounts. This undeniably benefits the country in a myriad of ways, giving the Australian government more funds to expand and improve on Australia's community. In this sense, improvements to the infrastructure will improve the overall appearance of Australia as a desirable tourism destination worldwide. Moving on, upon reaching the earlier months of 2012, it is seen that Australia began to suffer from a condition known as trade deficit. This is where the import totals were higher than the export total amounts. Trade deficit is an unfavorable state, where negative effects outweigh. For example, the country's money value, GDP, value will decrease. Many negative effects, indirect effects mainly, will take place when this occurs and will ultimately affect the tourism condition of Australia. A positive effect? Well, as seen in this graph, tourism arrivals increase because the GDP value of Australian dollar dropped. Balance on trade. In 2011, global price for export resources increased. Iron, coal and natural gas industry benefits from that. This made Australia a point of interest for trade internationally, therefore improving tourism industry. Another reason for the increase of tourism industry is due to the increased number of business visits by foreign visitors. The foreign visits will improve business relationships between Australia and other countries. Thus, this improves the number of tourists that will travel to Australia for business purposes. Foreign exchange that happens with this allows Australia to produce more goods and services with better quality, therefore improving the overall tourist industry. As the saying goes, every cloud does have a silver lining. In relation to this, international trade, as wonderful as it is to a country, it may also cause issues and problems to Australia. A few of them worth mentioning are: number 1, foreign investment. A surplus in foreign investment will and actually may probably allow a monopolization of domestic lands by foreign multinational companies. For example, let's say a multinational company buys Australian land or maybe buys over a factory. Australian manufactured products and some natural resources are taken by them, not local Australians. Number 2, foreign workforce. The more the countries increase in the amount of small marketing enterprises, large manufacturing companies and other labour-required jobs, the more the probability of those businesses to hire foreign labour due to them being cheaper. This may benefit the company nonetheless, but it will also decrease the employment rate and opportunity of jobs for local Australians to be employed. Next, leakages. Well, bringing in foreign imports, mainly foreign brands that are bought from locals, will cause money to leave Australia. Dependence on specific import. You see, if Australia were to rely too much on the imported goods of a certain country, what happens if that country would face an economic crisis, or maybe a natural disaster that prevents that country from manufacturing the products? Depending on the item, Australia will then be unable to supply to the citizens and exporting demand. Another worth noting problem is the depletion of natural resources. Any trade transaction that occurs in a country will definitely require a source. Mining, a significant and critical economy in Australia, may face depletion one day due to overproduction. To be certain, no country wants that to happen. In our point of view, a few recommendations and solutions may be implemented to fight the problems I mentioned earlier. Firstly, to implement government policies. This is mainly to reduce the involvement and monopolization of foreign multinational companies towards the Australian local and specialized economy. Next, to tighten immigration policies. Unlike a country we know very well, Malaysia, we should implement policies to only allow entry to the country that has a certain job specification level and also limit the number of allowed foreign labour. Last but not least, to practice conservational efforts and reserves to the natural available resources in Australia. Why? Well, a larger portion of Australia's land is mainly untouched wilderness. This untouched wilderness is also actually a selling point to tourists to visit Australia.
Well, we've got a few scopes of how tourism is affected by international trade in Australia. I must first emphasize though that tourism is only a minor economic sector in Australia. This is proven by data that we've collected from the Australian satellite accounts online, saying that tourism is only 5% in contribution to the total GDP. Well, besides this, the other limitations that we face is that we were really unable to get the accurate amount of how much Australian dollars acquired from international trade that contributes directly to tourism. Besides that, well, I hope you learned something from the video and enjoyed it as well. Misuma, you know what to do. Thank you guys.
The environment is stable. With this